Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. It is fantastic to be here and amazing to see all of you. So I'm just going to get stuck right into this. So today we're going to be exploring about how culture shapes the way that we can design UX for games. So this is quite a niche area in UX. So this is going to be a bit more of a guided tour through the process. So it's going to be about approach, case studies, highlights, and so on. So the goal is really to spark some ideas, start some conversations, and so on. If you want to talk about this on a deeper level, then please submit a question in the Q&A or come and talk to me after, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So, as mentioned, I'm Sam. I'm a UX designer at NetEase Games. So I have about a decade of experience supporting Chinese tech and gaming companies succeed globally. So most of those years were actually spent in Shanghai, where I would work in Mandarin daily, but now I'm based in the UK. So I found my passion eventually in UX, like a lot of us did a master's, and now this is where I'm specialized. I've supported over 10 games, many of which you can see up here, helping them to bridge the divide with international audiences. So I also work in a centralized research and design team called RED. So we're dedicated to supporting the teams in understanding the experience gap in between China and the Western market, and then helping them to adapt accordingly, accounting for accessibility all along the way. A lot of it is really about building empathy and understanding with the users and doing user-centered design processes and so on. So because we support a lot of different teams, we're able to spot a lot of common issues, create guiding principles, guidelines, and so on. So in today's content, I'll be talking briefly about some main concepts and some approaches. I'll be talking through 5 different divergences, each with a case study to really drill down into some details. Then, as we know, communication is a cornerstone of UX. So essentially, we'll be talking about some of the issues that we faced there as well. And then finally, some take-home tips for if you don't remember anything else, at least, take a picture or something. So it's no secret, I'm sure we've all seen it on the news, Chinese and Western studios are trying to break into each other's markets with mixed success, let's just say. What works in one market will feel completely off in the other. Assumptions made during design and development don't always translate. This has led to friction and disconnect between what the local players experience and what the intended design was along the way. So we've seen this in many of our own games with essentially negative feedback on terrible social media and really costly post-launch changes. And we've seen it in other games as well. And this has led to companies like Virtuos calling the challenge regionalism and talking about region-specific game versions, which is an interesting concept. But it is really important to say, from my experience and the data I've seen, that fundamentally players worldwide do share more similarities than differences. Essentially, core UX principles will stay the same, your usability principles and so on. However, cultural habits, social norms, local expectations will still deeply shape how games are experienced. Here's a quick example. So many of you might have used the F-shape reading pattern essentially when you come out to long-form content and so on. But how would you apply that to this traditional artistic vertical text of a Chinese poem in the game Where Winds Meet? It doesn't quite fit. If you were trying to design a global version of a game live streaming service, maybe you'd put your comments down the right-hand side like you see in Twitch and YouTube. But in China, streaming services have the comments floating across the screen in front of the video, which they find more immersive. So it might feel a bit jarring to you if you opened Twitch tomorrow and you noticed all your comments flying across the actual video. So how do we do this with a lot of our partner teams? So essentially, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. As we know, as UX designers, it depends is one of the most common phrases that we use. But when we support our partner teams, there's a lot of commonalities that we can go for. Essentially, first gain a firm understanding of what target markets and regions that you are going for specifically. Go beyond surface level research, use their apps, use their websites, see how designers approach with everything from how their products are designed in stores to how their subway signs and subway maps are designed, and if possible, talk to a local UX designer. Don't just reference games that you yourself are familiar with and that you like. Play games that have excelled in that market, or maybe not done as well as you expected, and you can learn a lot from them and the associated player feedback. This is an important one that we found. UX adaptation across markets is not a blanket fix. You need to pick your battles, make changes that actually move the needle. It's easy to fatigue a team's enthusiasm when you're trying to change everything, believe you me. So leverage tools like prioritization matrices and so on. Maybe you have an adaptation in mind, maybe you've made some changes. At that point, it's so important to prototype what you have and put it in front of users, because it's all an assumption, it's all an hypothesis, which is just an educated guess until it's proven. And then, as we all know, launch is not the finish line. Essentially, look at all of your telemetry data, look at all of your feedback, and parse it by the different regions, and you'll be surprised at the trends that you see. Another part of supporting our partner teams is about helping them to empathize with the local users. So we do what we call foundational UX methods, which is so important to do before you get to your wireframing, flows, designs, and so on. So the methods that we use will depend on the project, and many of them that you see here you might be familiar with, like personas and user narratives. But a big challenge that we found is finding what we call a common design language. So you need to get buy-in from these teams. They need to recognize the value that these methods bring. For example, journey mapping. Maybe you do a journey mapping for an onboarding flow, but maybe you're thinking about it from the perspective of learnability, maybe player confidence or meaningfulness during that. But actually, for example, when we were doing journey mapping, we found retention was the best word to use to bring, for example, the producers on board and so on. So to help demonstrate this, this is all really high-level stuff now. Let's look at some specific case studies. So a big divergence is layout. What is efficient to one culture may be complete overload in another. Here we have Taobao. It's essentially China's version of Amazon. You might look at that and feel pretty overwhelmed already. You know, there's lots of badges, there's lots of icons, there's lots of text and so on. But Chinese users are used to super feature-rich apps. They prioritize efficiency. So they have a huge amount of tolerance for these really complex interfaces. And so, as I'm sure you can imagine though, if you try to adapt this straight over to a Western market, for example, it would not go so well with the amount of cognitive load and so on. You might look at Amazon and you think, this is more intuitive, this is what I'm used to. But if you flip the perspective, what if a Chinese user opened Amazon for the first time? How might they feel? They probably, from talking to many of my colleagues, might feel like it's really empty. They feel like it's unfinished. They also hate the idea of swapping in between screens to find what they're looking for. And side by side, you can really see that difference in information density, information architecture approaches, and so on. So I've been working for a while now on Where Winds Meet, coming out in November overseas. Big challenge with this one, since it's already been out for about 6 months in China, is there's a huge amount of features, and they all need somewhere to go, like a main menu. So here is the Chinese main menu. Many of you might not be able to read this, but it has, I'm sure as you can tell, high cognitive load. Not so much clear findability from a Western perspective. No clear groupings, and so on. So we identified this early, worked together closely with the project team. And then we got the constraint, which many of you know, No time for huge systematic changes, no time to completely redo everything. So we went back to the information architecture drawing board, we did card sorting exercises internally and externally, built new taxonomies, we reduced a lot of the redundant entry points. It's super common in Chinese interfaces, and you might see a few icons that are the same throughout to have multiple entry points for the same feature. So once we kind of resolved some of these issues, prototyped all the different layouts and groupings, tested them with players, with surveys and voting and so on. And so here's our latest design, still in development. So you can see that there's clearer groupings with subheadings, clearer feature naming compared to what we had before. We removed a load of the redundant buttons with hopefully more still to go. And we had to combine a lot of the features as well. And side by side, you can see that clear difference. And so far, you know, we run lots of closed beta tests, and we've received some positive feedback, but mostly, you know, less complaints as well. You might be thinking, however, where did all those features go? So essentially, all of the gameplay modes were scattered throughout the main menu, and then we just brought them all together into a gameplay lobby, which is kind of a feature that many more Western players are used to. So it shows that, you know, even with some cost constraints, there are some changes you can make. Next is the idea that design approach can be completely different. What feels maybe like a common decision to us may feel like a huge decision to someone else. So Chinese designers work with a relatively limited set of fonts. A lot of this isn't about skill or taste, it's about the ecosystem. So most Chinese operating systems come installed essentially with many fewer pre-installed fonts. Each font itself has over 20,000 glyphs that you have to account for, making them super expensive to produce and license. They're also logographic, so you have to consider each character's recognition as well. So this was, again, a complex challenge for Where Winds Meet, helping them choose a font. So we talked to the project team and told them that they had a few key considerations to take on. Does it thematically fit with the ancient Chinese fantasy setting? Is it readable and accessible? Does it cover the languages that we need it to cover? Is the licensing straightforward? Does it fit with our in-house engine? Now, many of these considerations, a lot of you might be familiar with, but this was overwhelming for our Chinese colleagues. So we had to do a lot of training sessions. We had to create a lot of documentation for them to consider. And we had to together evaluate, shortlist, and score some of the different fonts. And we eventually chose Allegria for now, since this is still in development. So this was essentially our ultimate choice that we felt like balanced all of those themes that I mentioned earlier. And here we see the Chinese version with also some interface changes as well. So this essentially was a great learning process. I learned a lot more about Chinese fonts. They learned a lot more about Latin fonts as well too. But it's important to consider, just because you might think that something is a straightforward design consideration doesn't mean it is everywhere else. Next is monetization. Quite a sensitive one nowadays. So you might be somewhat familiar with RedNote. Many of you, when TikTok was banned in the US, users flocked towards RedNote instead. It is a social media that you're all familiar with. You know, you follow the lives of your friends and influencers and so on, but it is heavily monetized. There's a huge amount of brand collabs. You can do direct purchasing through posts and so on. China has a very advanced digital payment system. You can spend anything digitally. There's QR codes everywhere. There's third-party apps to manage your bank accounts and do direct payments through and so on. So users are super accepting of these kind of highly monetized apps, and that translates to games, where I'm sure you've seen some Chinese games with a huge amount of red dots, loads of store entry points, loads of, hey, limited time offer, which Western players are way more sensitive towards. They prefer transparent systems that don't interrupt immersion, and so on. So This was super important for Marvel Rivals, which I hope many of you have played. We had to work together with the project team pretty early on, providing references and guidelines with how to adapt their monetization, steering them more towards a store with direct purchasing, fewer currencies, clearer battle passes, and so on. Here is an earlier in-development version of their store. So you can already see some of the stuff I talked about in the previous version as well too about layout, but you can see from the visual design, information layout, UX patterns, they all communicate a lot of pressure, whether that's the bright colors or whether that's all the tags across all the different elements and so on. Whereas here is the current store design. So we adjusted the visuals to really reduce the sense of immediacy. There's more space, there's less pressuring patterns, and generally a calmer layout. When we put the designs side by side, we can really get a clearer sense, that feeling of urgency, trying to push players to spend, has dropped. Next is the idea that cultural values can very much inform how we might design our content as well. So, as is shown through this great Quantic Foundry piece of research, and from our own findings as well, Chinese society is super competitive, even though we might think of it as collective. From university entrance exams to the career ladder, so Chinese players engage deeply with these kind of features like leadership boards, PvP rankings, having that comparative performance visibility inside of all their gameplay modes. So as we know, Western players are also super keen on competitive gameplay modes, but they also value a lot more positive team dynamics as well. But that means there's a tendency for China-developed games to focus mainly on competitive systems, not so much on collaborative ones. So this was, again, an important consideration for Destiny Rising, which came out a couple of weeks ago now. They have a huge amount of group content. Anyone who's played Destiny 2 knows about strikes and so on and so forth. And with that kind of rich content, we really wanted to reinforce a more collaborative group atmosphere. So previously at the group recap stage, after you finish a strike, there was just a simple thumbs up your friends, and it doesn't really do anything after that. But we encouraged them to implement a deeper commendation system instead. So that might seem like something that might be obvious to you and I. We've seen it all in Overwatch and other games, but this was not something that was common for China-developed games. So pushing this forwards and encouraging them to make these adaptations was super important. And finally is accessibility, which is growing globally. Here we have Wang Ziying, the winner of the women's wheelchair singles at Wimbledon. That's a lot of W's, who is from China. So accessibility is rapidly gaining traction there, which hasn't always historically been the case. There's an aging population, there's more government policies, there's the impact of COVID, and so on. Even though it's a foundational expectation for us, but as the market matures, companies like NetEase Games are increasingly embracing it. And actually the Destiny Rising developers, all credit to them, approached us for this as well. They wanted us to help them identify areas that they could make their game playable for all players. So we guided them through some key industry standards, some considerations to have tailored to their gameplay and their goals and their platform and so on. And so now for release, we have, for example, color assistance with icons so that they're not all color dependent. We have reading assistance as well, and we have motion sickness assistance, all on release with more to come soon, which generally I would say goes above and beyond what is expected for a mobile game, and even more so a game developed in China. Now, none of this would have been possible to get to these stages without learning how to collaborate cross-culture. Anyone who's worked in a cross-cultural team will know that issues can happen. Firstly is the idea, even if you have a common language or you have a translator, misunderstandings will occur. So you have to customize your communication for clarity. So that's the idea of avoiding idioms, breaking up your content so people have time to catch up when they're translating in their brains. And it's the idea that acronyms and terminology can completely change across cultures. Like in China, they still use GUI designer for UI artist, essentially, which is a pretty old term from our perspective. Next is the idea that sometimes you create your design artifacts, but your intent is not understood. So we had that situation where we were trying to soften our communication because we were under essentially the impression that for Chinese developers, they would want to save face, which is a very common stereotype. But then that ended up costing us a lot of opportunities. So we questioned the stereotype. We started leaning towards clarity. We started being more candid with leadership. We started to highlight risks early and clearly with them from the very beginning, while very importantly staying neutral, not just being mean about it. And that really helped. And finally is the idea that working cross-culture development processes can be completely different, and then your proposals with these developers do not end up landing. In China, team structures, development gates, and everything involved with pipelines and so on are completely different. So that means your proposals might not hit the same because stakeholders are prioritizing completely different things than what you might be pitching. So we started to try and learn their approach and what their persuasion triggers were. It's very important to do research, communicate, and do a bit of trial and error to see what works. A very important thing is not to try to fix their development approach or say, that's not how you develop a game, and be a bit more open-minded about it. So we didn't completely change everything that we did, but we adapted our research, design documentation, proposals, our wireframes and so on, to better match what local stakeholders value. So that was, for Chinese market especially, competitive analysis, for example. Even many of our design documentation, even if you do your grey box wireframes, you still need to have it wrapped in a nice shiny wrapper that looks good. So it's very important for us to polish those proposals, and then they started landing a lot better. So now for some key takeaways. Firstly, it's just being aware of the fact that cultural nuance will really shape player experience globally is a great first step. Be prepared to adapt. Don't just assume, hey, I'm going to design this based upon a mental model I know is common. Other players might not understand it. Reference how players use local products and understand why they might have succeeded or failed. Some key areas that we've identified are layout, socials, lore, and monetization. Leverage your foundational UX methods or your user-centered design methods. Don't just go straight to wireframe. Adapt carefully, save costs, and save the sanity of your team as well. Refine your communication, avoid stereotypes, like we did with saving face. And I hope you consider the fact that small tweaks can always lead up to big experience shifts. So, next time you're developing something, maybe ask yourself, what would happen if we just ship this design globally to all players from all cultures? How might it land? Would we need to do any changes? Would everyone still understand? So, be aware, be adaptive, and be player-centered. So, if you want to do any further reading, I personally quite like the culture map and Hofstede's cultural dimensions. They're big generalizations, but it's a good reference point. I also love Kate Edwards' talks about culturalization, super useful. Or connect with me on LinkedIn, via email, or the We Can Fix It in UI Discord. If you know, you know. Okay, so I think it's question o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. We have a few questions, so that's awesome. Keep them coming, and you can upvote the questions that you like so that we can ask them in priority. So the first question on the list is, Sam, what is your advice on how to redesign a Western game for Chinese market? Where should a designer start?
I would start by essentially going out and finding a Chinese designer to help you with that, to be honest. Personally, I might be able to help. I've spotted a lot of key patterns. I've played a lot of Chinese games, but really, as I'm sure we're all aware, you really need to grow up in a local context to be able to completely understand the cultural nuances of a certain society, or at least spend a long time there. So I think that would be the most ideal. If not, as I said, play a lot of Chinese games. Go and visit if you can. It's a really cool experience. And you'll see things like, for example, there's no wheelchair access ramps in the subway and things like that, which will give you a lot more insight into some of the small changes that you might need to make. And as well, even no matter what, if you want to publish in China, you need to find a Chinese partner. It's not technically possible to publish a game in China without a Chinese partner, so leverage them as well.
Cool, thank you. All right, Marvel Rivals Sword redesign. Did the Western version with less pressure monetize better in the end? Can pressuring improve monetization if done right? Ooh.
Oh, tough question. Well, the way that I see it is that you have a lot of very KPI focused folks where maybe, let's say, you bring a new pop-up that as soon as the player first enters the game, they see the pop-up leading them to the store, which is a prime example. Maybe the people will be looking at the metrics of that and say, hey, we saw a click-through rate of 10% more users. This is great. Let's continue doing this. But essentially, it's more important to track the long-term viability of these methods. Essentially, well, yes, maybe you're getting a click-through rate of 10%, but how is this affecting the gameplay in other ways? How many players are getting annoyed by the fact that they're being bombarded by pop-ups now? How many of them just aren't even reading it and clicking out of it? Is it even worth your time to do? I mean, it's always a good reference for example, when Genshin Impact first came out, wasn't super pushy with the store. Essentially, you played characters that were really cool, and then you thought, hey, I want that character as well. I'm going to spend an insane amount of money to try and get them. And that was an effective strategy without being incredibly pushy. And sometimes the, let's say, the more open methods can be slightly better, in my opinion.
Thanks for this answer. I'm going to shamelessly plug the Ethical Games initiative if you want to learn more about ethics in the game industry, how to monetize. So ethicalgames.org if you want to participate in this discussion. All right, so how do you approach the mix of cultural perceptions and different UX on cross-platform experiences like in Hoyo Games? Where do you start designing from?
Yeah, so Where Winds Meet has the interesting challenge of the fact that it's on all of the platforms. It's on mobile, PC, console, which is tough. And I think a big part of that is choosing, firstly, the right starting point of where to design from. I often recommend designing first with console, because it's really the hardest one to design for with your limited inputs and the fact that players are going to be sitting maybe 3 meters back from their TV and so on. But there's also the fact that, yes, culture does very much come into play with this as well. The way that we use our mobile phones is completely different as well. Like in China, you do everything through your mobile phone. Young people don't cook, for example. I remember when it was COVID and the government was sending everyone food to their homes, and we received all the feedback that actually none of the younger team members had any pots or pans to cook any of the food with. People generally just order online for food. And so when you have a society that uses their phones a lot, then it will completely change how people approach these technologies as well.
Thank you. We have a few people asking for the slide with the main lessons to take a photo. Thank you. What was involved in the motion sickness settings you mentioned? What were the triggers in your game?
Yeah, so Destiny Rising has the challenge, the fact that you can swap between first person and third person, making it even more difficult with motion sickness. So at the beginning, it was a lot of the time to do with the reticule, it was to do with motion blur, it's to do with a lot of these more common factors. I think for now there's only 2 settings for motion sickness, but there are more to come. As you know, oftentimes accessibility features sadly come out after release, but we were very thankful that we did have a good amount for release, actually.
Thank you. You mentioned the cognitive load for Western audiences. Do you find cognitive load applies differently to a Chinese audience or just not applicable?
Yeah, so cognitive load is an interesting one, and it's probably one of the most frequent words I use at work. I think the word I like to use is tolerance. I think a lot of people try to use the word preference, that Chinese players prefer a more complicated interface, but also at the same time, Apple is one of the most popular products in China, and they have relatively minimal designs. If Apple was that popular in China, how would they have succeeded, essentially? So I personally think that there's just a much higher tolerance for these kind of complex interfaces, and I think it's more about the idea of efficiency instead. Essentially, these players want to feel efficient with how they move and navigate around your interface. They want generally everything in one place. They don't want to swap to this feature, then to this feature, then to this feature. I'm using 3 features just to upgrade my character. I think it's, personally, that's my take on it, but there's so many articles with people saying different things. Everything from the fact that Chinese characters are more complex, and so that's why they prefer more complex interfaces, which I think is a bit of a stretch, but I would definitely say tolerance is one of the things I can be sure of.
Thanks. Out of the changes that you implemented, do you have one you'd say had the highest impact, most significant difference?
Oh, that's a good question. We've done work on a lot of games. Let me think. So I do think a lot of the changes that we're making to the idea of immersion for Where Winds Meet is a lot of big changes that have to be made. So for example, actually I was talking about some people with this last night, the idea of immersion is very different cross-culture. For us, a lot of the time the immersion comes down to less UI. Maybe the UI is contextual and dynamic and it hides at certain stages of the game. But for them, the idea of immersion often means, hey, maybe the UI really fits with the visuals of the game and it has all this decoration around it to help draw you into that world instead. So generally, I think that when it came to Where Winds Meet, especially with the fact that it's being released on PlayStation as well, and PlayStation single-player gamers have a certain expectation with all your Sony first-party games being very immersive. We've had to really go back and do a lot of cuts, a lot of consolidations, a lot of hiding from the original Chinese version. The original Chinese version that came out 6 months ago, though, was very, very successful. It's done very well. But it's very interesting when we did the first, to do the first closed beta test with fewer changes to then establish a baseline. And it was very interesting to see some of the, brutal feedback.
Why do you think Chinese games typically don't use a commendation system? How do you manage to convince them to have this feature?
So I think it's for them just a priority on competitiveness. They would rather see a leaderboard and see I've done more damage than someone else than commend someone for being a great teammate. It's just different priorities and different cultural approaches, and I don't think, and that's just a trend that we've seen. Not to say Chinese players will never use a commendation system. Oftentimes we have to talk in generalizations when we're talking about so many players. But convincing Destiny Rising really came down to my previous slide on helping your proposals land. So a lot of that was about really competitive analysis, especially producers. I found in the Chinese market are quite risk averse. They want to see that something has already worked. They like to see case studies, so on and so forth, before they decide to spend the extra budget, because that's where we come in. They already have their beautiful Gantt charts laid out, and then we have to come in and be like, actually, we want to add something else into that. So you have to be very convincing when you're trying to add or change or redo a new feature. And player data always helps. So oftentimes we'll do larger closed or open beta tests, and we take the collection of data for those very seriously in the way that it's scored and the way that we essentially pass through that data.
All right, one last before we move on. How is classical UX work such as Don Norman's treated in China? Is it known and used, unknown, or something else?
Yeah, so a lot of it is very similar, essentially throughout the process. I think you do have a lot of different pressures and a lot of different structures, depending especially on what game that you work on. But I would say across many different Chinese video game studios, there is the trend that it's very game designer-led or creative director-led. So oftentimes your game designer will set requirements, and then everyone else follows with those requirements, and then everyone can give their input and give recommendations and proposals and so on, but it's incredibly game designer-led. So I think not everyone shares that reading of, you know, these UX principles, like your Nielsen's 10 heuristics and all that kind of stuff. Not everyone is as well read on that. And especially from a Chinese perspective, they're reading all of this translated over into Chinese a lot of the time, and it just doesn't land as well. I've read some of the game UX books that I've read in Chinese, but previously read in English, and it just doesn't land as well, essentially, when you're trying to take, like, I don't know, someone's name and you're trying to put it into Chinese characters, and it ends up being really long, and you're like, wow, I'm not going to remember that. So there is a certain challenge, and there is a lot of like cross-pollination and learning different strategies and approaches between these cultures that I think is really interesting, and I've learned a lot about some of the methodologies that they prioritize as well.
Thank you so much, Sam. Can we give a round of applause to Sam?